Some fighters win by turning tighter, some by flying faster. The F-15 Eagle won by doing everything at once, and doing it bigger than anyone expected. It was America's largest dedicated fighter, heavy, twin-engined, and built to dominate the Cold War skies. But size alone wasn't what made it legendary. The secret was hidden inside: two Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofans. The story of the F-15's engines starts in the 1960s. The U.S. Air Force had dominated the skies with the F-4 Phantom, but a shock came from the Soviet Union. They unveiled the MiG-25 Foxbat, which was a massive interceptor that could fly over Mach 2.8 and climb above 70,000 feet. Suddenly, America needed a true air superiority fighter, something tougher that would be able to win dogfights against anything in the sky. McDonnell Douglas designed the airframe. Pratt & Whitney had the harder task: an engine that could outlast surging thrust demands, sustain Mach 2.5, and still be maintainable by crews around the world. Out of that urgency came a machine that promised unmatched power, and at the core of it was a brand new F-100. The F-15 carries two Pratt & Whitney F-100 afterburning turbofans. Each one produces around 23,770 pounds of thrust in the early F-100PW100 model. Later versions like the F-100PW229 raised that to over 29,000 pounds each. That's nearly 60,000 pounds of thrust in total on an aircraft that weighs less than 45,000 pounds fully loaded. For the first time in U.S. service, a fighter had a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1. The F-100 used a low 0.36 to 1 bypass ratio. That made it more efficient than a pure turbojet in cruise, but with the afterburner lit, it unleashed phenomenal raw power. But raw numbers weren't enough. To truly give America dominance, the F-100 had to meet goals no fighter engine had ever achieved before. Here's something to think about. What happens when a fighter jet has more thrust than weight? Drop your guesses in the comments and we'll return to that in the end. The F-100 wasn't just about raw thrust. It was designed around 4 demanding goals. First, it had to give the F-15 a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1 so the jet could climb like a rocket. Second, it needed to sustain supersonic speed, reaching and holding Mach 2.5 at altitude. Third, it had to respond instantly to throttle inputs, delivering power in seconds rather than minutes. And finally, it had to be reliable enough to survive thousands of hours in harsh combat conditions. Together, these goals pushed fighter engine design into uncharted territory. Meeting all 4 at once was revolutionary for the time. Most engines before the 1970s forced trade-offs like choosing either efficiency or thrust, speed or lifespan. The F-100 aimed to deliver everything together. Ambition on paper meant nothing without metals that could survive fire and stress. That's where the choice of materials became the difference between theory and reality. At the heart of the F-100 were materials built for extremes. The fan and compressor blades used titanium alloys, combining lightness with strength. The turbines relied on nickel-based superalloys that were able to withstand exhaust temperatures above 1,500 degrees Celsius. The blades were hollow with tiny channels that let cooler air flow inside. This prevented them from melting under afterburner heat. Ceramic coatings shielded surfaces from heat creep, preventing blades from warping under constant high temperatures. The engine was also modular. Instead of removing the entire unit for repairs, maintainers could replace sections like compressors or turbines individually. This made the F-100 cheaper and faster to service on bases around the world. The F-100 demanded precise airflow. The F-15's intakes used variable ramps to slow supersonic air before it entered the engine. Inside, variable guide vanes adjusted angle and pressure in order to prevent stalls. Fuel was managed by early electronic controls, later replaced with digital electronic engine control. This allowed smooth throttle transitions whether at idle, military power, or full afterburner. Pilots described the throttle response as instant. Push forward and the jet lunges forward right away. Pull back and the surge eases without hesitation. But that power came at a cost. In full afterburner, a single F-100 could burn nearly 1,000 gallons of fuel per hour. That's why the Eagle often carried drop tanks. The F-100's debut wasn't smooth. Early versions suffered from compressor stalls and hard surges. A stall could blow out the flame, causing the engine to lose thrust. A surge could damage compressor blades. Pilots quickly learned to handle the throttle gently during transitions. Pratt and Whitney engineers worked to refine airflow management. They reshaped compressor blades and stators to smooth out airflow at high angles of attack, reducing the risk of stalls. Then they re-engineered variable stator vanes to react more precisely to throttle changes, helping the compressor stay stable across a wide speed range. The company also introduced digital electronic engine control to replace older mechanical fuel controls, giving pilots smoother transitions into afterburner and preventing sudden surges. Even the fuel nozzles were redesigned to atomize kerosene more evenly, which improved combustion stability. By the mid-1980s, the problems were mostly solved. The F-100 matured into one of the most dependable engines in the Air Force inventory. Once engineers solved those flaws, the F-15 showed the world what the engines could really do in the sky. Once tamed, the engines transformed the F-15 in the air. The Eagle could reach Mach 2.5 at altitude. It could maintain supersonic speed without an afterburner, long before stealth jets made it trendy. Its climb rate exceeded 50,000 feet per minute. In practice, that meant an F-15 could take off, pull vertical, and soar past 30,000 feet in under a minute. Pilots described it as riding a rocket, watching the horizon fall away. Performance was dazzling, but it came with the hidden cost of heat, temperatures that could destroy the very turbines delivering that thrust. Power at this scale creates heat problems. Exhaust gases at full afterburner reach levels that could destroy unprotected turbines. The F-100 solved this with hollow turbine blades carrying cooling air inside, plus ceramic thermal coatings to resist extreme temperatures. Bleed air flowed strategically to keep hot spots under control. Even with these innovations, pilots limited afterburner use. Continuous runs risked overheating. That's why tactics often involved pulsing the burners, which were short bursts for acceleration, and then throttling back to military power. Cooling wasn't glamorous, but without it, the Eagle's signature vertical climbs and supersonic dashes would have been impossible. And if heat was one enemy, fuel burn was another. The F-100's thirst defined how the F-15 was used. At cruise, fuel efficiency was respectable, but with afterburners lit, consumption skyrocketed. Two engines could burn through nearly 2,000 gallons of fuel in an hour. That's why most missions relied on drop tanks. The F-15 could carry three, one under the fuselage and one under each wing. With tanks, its range extended beyond 3,000 kilometers. Without them, endurance dropped sharply. Air-to-air refueling became standard. Tankers like the KC-135 kept Eagles in the sky during long patrols or deep strikes. The system meant range was no longer about the jet alone, but about the network behind it. Power was always at hand. Range was always a calculation. Still, the engines weren't just about speed and endurance. They were also the beating heart of every system on board. Engines don't just provide thrust, they power everything else. The F-100 supplied bleed air for cockpit pressurization and environmental systems. It drove hydraulics that controlled flight surfaces. It generated electricity for radar, avionics, and weapons. The Eagle's intakes adjusted automatically in supersonic flight to keep airflow stable. Without this, the engines would stall. This system would let pilots focus on flying and fighting, not managing airflow. Two engines meant a safety margin that gave pilots confidence to push the aircraft in combat. And when those systems and engines met real combat, the result was an unmatched record that still stands today. The true test of any engine is combat. The F-100 passed with flying colors. The F-15 Eagle holds a perfect air-to-air combat record, over 100 victories, 0 losses. From the Bekaa Valley in 1982 to later conflicts, F-100-powered Eagles consistently outclimbed, outran, and outgunned opponents. The engine also proved versatile. It powered the early F-16 Fighting Falcon, showing it could handle both heavy twin-engine fighters and lighter single-engine designs. Upgrades continued through the 1990s and 2000s. Digital controls improved reliability. New materials boosted thrust. Even today, the F-100 remains in service with upgraded F-15 variants around the world. Its legacy lives on in every modern fighter that demands both thrust and endurance. Remember the question about thrust being greater than weight? The answer is that it can accelerate vertically. The F-15 Eagle became America's largest and most powerful fighter. And its F-100 engines were the heart of that story. They gave it a perfect combat record. Most fighters are small, fast, and built to turn on a dime. The Tupolev Tu-128 Fiddler wasn't. It stretched almost 100 feet, weighed more than 40 tons, and looked closer to a passenger jet than anything you'd expect in a dogfight. So why did the Soviets call the Fiddler a fighter at all? The answer takes us to the Arctic. Endless, empty skies where American bombers could slip past Soviet defenses. And to patrol that space, the Fiddler needed engines powerful enough to carry a monster across half a continent. By the late 1950s, the Soviet Union faced a unique problem. Its northern borders stretched across endless Arctic wilderness, far from dense airbase networks. American bombers armed with nuclear weapons could fly through this space, and smaller Soviet fighters like the MiG-21 simply didn't have the endurance to stop them. The Soviet Air Defense Force needed a new kind of interceptor, something that could patrol for hours, carry a large radar, and also fire long-range missiles. Tupolev, famous for its bombers, was tasked with building it. The result was the Tu-128. But for such a huge aircraft, ordinary engines would never do. Engineers chose the Lolka AL-7F2 turbojets, proven in other aircraft but adapted for very different roles. These engines gave the Tu-128 its reach, its speed, and its unique identity. The Tu-128 was powered by two Lolka AL-7F2 afterburning turbojets. Each engine produced around 22,000 pounds of thrust, or 98 kilonewtons with afterburner, giving the aircraft a combined thrust of over 44,000 pounds. The AL-7F2 had already been used in the Sukhoi Su-7 fighter bomber, but Tupolev engineers adapted it for long-range interception. This meant focusing on endurance and reliability as much as sheer thrust. These were large axial flow turbojets with 9 compressor stages, an annular combustion chamber, and variable exhaust nozzles. At full afterburner, the roar of the engines could be heard for miles, and the Tu-128 accelerated past Mach 1.5 despite its size. Each engine on the Tu-128 was nearly the size of an entire early MiG fighter. Together, they turned a massive interceptor into a machine capable of racing across the Arctic skies. But power alone wasn't enough. Those engines had to survive Arctic cold and supersonic heat. So let's look at how they were built. The AL-7F2 engines were built with Soviet metallurgy that had to handle enormous stress. Compressor blades were made from high-strength steel alloys, optimized to handle long patrols in freezing conditions. Turbine blades used nickel-based alloys designed to withstand extreme exhaust temperatures. Combustion chambers were annular, spreading heat evenly to reduce hotspots. Soviet engineers emphasized ruggedness over finesse. The AL-7F2 was not as light as some Western engines, but it could handle the harsh conditions of Siberia without frequent replacement. Anti-icing systems were integrated into the intakes, channeling hot bleed air over the lips to prevent frost from forming. Without this, the Tu-128's engines could choke on ice crystals within minutes of flight in Arctic winter. The Tu-128 was never exported, so its engines had to work reliably under Soviet maintenance alone. Strong metals were one thing, feeding the core was another. Supplying air to the AL-7F2s required huge lateral intakes along the fuselage. These intakes were designed to capture enough airflow at both subsonic patrol speeds and supersonic dash. Variable guide vanes controlled how air was delivered to the compressor, preventing stalls. Fuel was equally critical. The Tu-128 carried nearly 20 tons of kerosene in multiple tanks spread through its fuselage and wings. Pumps and transfer systems constantly moved fuel to maintain the aircraft's center of gravity. Without this balancing act, the interceptor would have been unstable as its massive tanks emptied. At full throttle with afterburner, the Tu-128's engines could burn through around 500 kilograms of fuel per minute. That meant a supersonic interception dash was measured in minutes, not hours. But at cruise, the AL-7F2s were efficient enough to give the Tu-128 a combat radius of 1,500 kilometers. Think of it this way. The Tu-128 was essentially a flying fuel tank wrapped around 2 giant turbojets. Testing the Tu-128's engines revealed challenges unique to its mission. Intake icing was a constant threat in Arctic air. Engineers added heating ducts to keep airflow clear. Compressor stalls occurred during sharp throttle movements at high altitude. Pilots were trained to advance power smoothly. Heat stress on turbine blades required frequent inspection. Soviet mechanics became adept at swapping blades before cracks spread. Despite these issues, the AL-7F2s earned a reputation for reliability. Unlike more temperamental engines of the era, they rarely failed in patrol conditions. That reliability mattered more than agility because the Tu-128's job was to loiter for hours before unleashing a short burst of supersonic speed. The AL-7F2s gave the Tu-128 remarkable performance for an aircraft of its size. It could reach a top speed of Mach 1.6 at altitude and climb to a service ceiling of about 60,000 feet or 18 kilometers. With full fuel and missiles, its combat radius stretched to roughly 1,500 kilometers, while in ferry configuration it could cover nearly 3,000 kilometers without stopping. These numbers put the Tu-128 in a league of its own. Smaller fighters could outmaneuver it, but none could stay airborne as long or cover as much ground. Pilots described the engines as steady at cruise and forceful in afterburner. At full power, the Tu-128 accelerated smoothly despite its weight. But they also noted how quickly the fuel gauges dropped during supersonic runs. The engines of the Tu-128s weren't working alone. In fact, they were part of a carefully balanced system. The Interceptor carried the Smerch radar, one of the largest ever fitted to a fighter. It could detect bombers at long range, guiding the Tu-128's R-4 air-to-air missiles. Those missiles were heavy and draggy, meaning the engines had to provide enough thrust to carry both the plane and its weapons load. This integration meant the Tu-128 wasn't a fighter in the traditional sense. It was a system with radar, missiles, and the engines all working together. The AL-7F2S were the muscle behind it all, ensuring the Interceptor could carry heavy loads without losing supersonic ability. But every supersonic run fought the physics of temperature. Running giant turbojets at supersonic speeds creates enormous heat. The AL-7F2s faced exhaust temperatures exceeding 1,700 degrees Celsius in afterburner. Without advanced cooling, turbine blades would have melted within minutes. Soviet engineers used several solutions: hollow turbine blades with internal cooling channels, nickel alloys that resisted creep and cracking under stress, thermal coatings that reflected heat away from vulnerable surfaces. Even with these measures, maintenance teams had to replace blades regularly. The Tu-128's engines were tough, but they paid a price in durability every time afterburners were engaged. But endurance was the real weapon, and the tanks had to feed it. Fuel defined the Tu-128's role as much as its engines. With nearly 20 tons of kerosene on board, the aircraft could patrol for hours. Fuel pumps constantly balanced the load, shifting kerosene between tanks to maintain stability. Engineers even designed redundant pumps, ensuring the engines would never starve mid-patrol. At cruise, the AL-7F2s were relatively efficient, burning a fraction of their maximum fuel flow. But once the afterburners lit, consumption skyrocketed. At full power, the Tu-128 could drain over a ton of fuel in just a few minutes. This is why pilots used afterburner sparingly. The engines gave the Tu-128 range, but they also demanded respect. A commander had to plan every dash carefully, knowing fuel burn would limit how long the fighter could chase intruders. The Lolka AL-7F2 engines powered the Tu-128 from its introduction in 1964 until its retirement in the 1980s. They were not revolutionary, but they proved that scaling up existing designs could serve unique needs. The Tu-128 was eventually replaced by the MiG-31, whose engines were more efficient and more responsive. Yet without the AL-7F2s, the Soviet Union would never have fielded an interceptor capable of patrolling its vast northern borders. The legacy of these engines lives on as a reminder that sometimes endurance and reliability are just as vital as speed and agility. The Tu-128's engines were not perfect, but they made possible the largest fighter jet ever built. The Fiddler remains history's largest fighter, and its Lolka AL-7F2 engines were the heart of its story. And that raises the bigger question: what other machines push the limits of size and power in aviation? If you enjoyed this one, make sure to like, subscribe, and join us again because the next engine story is already waiting for you.